absolutely delighted to introduce all the speakers for today's webinar, Building Trustworthy Data Practices. So we've got Wiktoria Kulik and Dr. Kevin Macnish from Sopra Steria. We've got Jane Crow, Mike Rose and Andrew Newman from the ODI. So Wiktoria, would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps say a couple of words about your role at Sopra Steria?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm Wiktoria. I head up digital ethics consulting at Sopra Steria as part of the wider ethics and sustainability practice that Kevin will tell you a bit more about. But in my role, what I usually do is help organizations in private and public sector understand how they can improve the way they create or deploy technology and make sure that they're advancing positive outcomes for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Wiktoria. And Kevin, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Joe. And thank you for Wiktoria as well. You gave me a good introduction there. Kevin Macnish, so I head up the the ethics and sustainability consulting practice at Sopra Steria, which essentially is, as Wiktoria was saying, talking to clients in the public and private sector about digital ethics, how technology can be improved, and also looking at sustainability fairly obviously as well. So what is the carbon footprint of people's IT estates? What is the impact of what their technology is doing on the environment, and how can we help them to improve that?
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. Jane, could you say perhaps a couple of words about your role at the Open Data Institute?
Hi, yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Crow. I lead the Data Institutions Programme here at the ODI, as Joe said. So the programme helps to improve ways that data can be stewarded responsibly. So for us, data institutions are organisations that steward data on behalf of others for public, educational or charitable aims. And we do this through research to advance understanding of the types of organisations that do this, and the roles they play, because they can be quite different. We feel there is no set model for a data institution, and they can vary in their roles. So we've done a lot of research to understand what those roles are, and also by providing practical support to help the development and the design and sometimes even the operation of data institutions. So essentially, it's all about responsible data stewardship. And of course, trust and trustworthy practices sit right at the heart of that.
Great, thanks, Jane. And Mike, could you give us a couple of words on your background, please?
Of course. Thanks, Joe. So hi, I'm Mike. I'm an associate at the ODI. My background's around intellectual property rights, data sharing, data licensing, that kind of stuff. I've been working on the project, which Andrew's going to talk about in a moment, since June this year. And my role here today is to I'm going to ask some difficult questions in a bit.
That's great. That's great. Thanks so much, Mike. And Andrew, last but not least, could you introduce yourself, please, and then perhaps we can start with your presentation. Thank you. Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Apologies. So I'm Andrew Newman. I'm the Principal Data Specialist here at the Open Data Institute. And as part of that role, I've been working, leading our work on data assurance. And as part of that work, we've been thinking about what a trustworthy data organisation might look like. So if we move on to the next slide, Sam. At ODI, we are trying to build the foundations for trustworthy open data ecosystems. And we've been thinking about organisations and what a good data organisation looks like. This is really important to us at ODI because we think this is key to supporting our mission and vision. So if we just jump on a slide. ODI is a mission-focused not-for-profit organisation, and we work to create a world where data works for everyone, for all organisations, for all governments. And we believe that to deliver that vision, we need to have an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. And that is really critical in successfully deploying technologies, including AI systems. We know from engaging with our members and clients that trust is really an essential foundation for a data ecosystem, and without it, it's impossible to create the conditions for data collection, use and sharing, particularly sharing. And we know that sharing of data is really critical in a lot of ecosystems for delivering social, economic and environmental value. As ODI, we do a number of things. We have a really strong research practice looking at the kind of data horizon. We have a consulting and learning team who work with clients to help them improve their data practices. And we have a strong public policy team who work to influence governments and to convene organisations and to provide safe spaces to think and talk about data. If we just move on to the next slide. So thinking about ODI's research. So ODI's been researching data organisations and building our understanding of data organisations for the 11 years that we've existed. We think based on our research and based on our engagement with clients, we think that we know what good data practice looks like. And building on that, what we've been able to do is define a set of organisational data practices. Our research has identified that there are lots of technical frameworks for data management, things like DAMA's DMBOK or the RM Council frameworks. But what we've identified is there's a significant gap between those frameworks and the kind of strategic business considerations organisations need to make to be trustworthy with data. And what we're aiming to do is to fill this gap by thinking about organisational practices that should underpin the collection, use and sharing of data. So if we just move on to the next slide. Something weird's happening with the slides. There we go. Thank you. So these are our 9 data practices. These practices have been designed to fill that gap between the strategic aims of an organisation and the organisation's data collection and use. They've been designed to complement those technical frameworks that already exist, and they've been designed to be widely understood. We want these data practices to be meaningful to chief executives who are probably not data experts. We want them to be understandable to people who are making considerations and judgments about whether they should share their data with organisations. For each of these 9 practices, we've developed definitions and we've developed indicators that organisations can measure themselves against to understand whether they're trustworthy with data. And I will talk a little bit more about some of the products we're using the practices to build at the end of the call. That's all I really wanted to say about ODI's work on data practices, and I'm really delighted to be joined by colleagues at Sopra today, because I think having a discussion on data practice, and particularly with Sopra's focus on ethical data, I think that's going to be a really interesting session. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin and Wiktoria now to talk about some of the stuff that's going on at Sop.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and thank you, yes, for sharing those data practices. I think it's a really interesting list that we've got there, and as you say, it should be a really powerful thing in helping to close that gap between strategy and starting to enact some of this. One of the practices that we're very keen on developing is to move beyond companies that look for a purely technical response to the apparently technical challenge that they have around data ethics. So a lot of people that we've spoken to, a lot of clients we've spoken to in the past have tended to say, well, we understand that algorithms and AI can be biased. So the solution to that is let's buy a bias checker or a fairness checker or whatever. And yet we know that those are at best about 40% effective. Similarly with PII, private information scanners, that they are also around 40, maybe 50% effective. The problem is that so many of the values we have and the challenges that we face are contextualized, and therefore you cannot have a tool which goes through that very simply and straightforwardly. So in addition to technical solutions for technical problems, we also need to look for human solutions and look for cultural inputs, if you like, that we can have. And I think that that list that you have there is very helpful in doing that. We have a slightly an alternative approach which we take in trying to bring some of these ethical principles to life, I suppose, in a way from, you know, bringing this together with the principles that you've just shared. You're kind of looking at that move from the C-suite down into the operationalization level. What we thought we'd share today was moving down yet another layer in the operationalization stack, if you like, to look at the data lifecycle, and particularly how the sort of questions which you might ask change as you move through that data life cycle. So we can talk about the importance of privacy, we can talk about the importance of fairness, but we don't want to just talk about the wants. Again, there may be a temptation to say, well, if we put into place the requirement that our data is fair, then when we have our algorithm, when we have our tool at the end of the day, it should be fair because that was the requirement. But if you think about it, when we design a car, we don't just say, okay, this car has to be safe, and then when the car rolls out onto the road, we test it for safety. The whole way through the build and development of the car, we test the various aspects to safety. We test the brakes, we test the steering column, we test the, I don't know, the seat belts, whatever for safety. So what we're trying to get at here with this model is that there's a need to do something very similar with data and the data lifecycle. So when we're talking about collecting data or creating data, clearly we need to be thinking about people's privacy, if there is the personal data or personal related data involved there, transparency to people who you're collecting it from, and the dangers of bias as to where the data is coming from. When it comes to processing, again, there could be privacy issues, but slightly different in this time because here you could be talking about challenges of privacy that come from aggregating data sets. When you talk about bias in the processing stage, you might find that it's not just bias in the nature of the data set, but also the parameters that you're using in the development of the algorithm to understand or to take that algorithm forwards. What are you looking for? Are there cultural factors involved in that? What's the environmental impact? Then when it comes to use, and Victoria and I were at a conference yesterday where people were talking very much about the focus of ethics being on use, and clearly that's important. As you can see, creation, collection, and processing, that there are also ethical elements there too. But how do we put guardrails in place so that technology and data are used well, so that we can think about what's the impact on people's skill set, what's the impact on workforces, workforce displacement and safety. And then obviously we move on to storage. Again, there can be issues there. We've got a sort of classic CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability in terms of cybersecurity, and then on to the end of the data life cycle with destruction, transparency being around the destruction of data and the safety of it, and so on. So as you can see by moving through this, we've got ethical questions which come up the whole way around using data that they can change as we go through the data life cycle. And so that's the problem. Apologies, everybody. I realized I was too far away from the microphone. Hopefully you can now hear me better.
That's great, Kevin. Thank you so much for that, the overview of the data life cycle. So, Mike, should we go into the roundtable discussion?
Let's do that. That sounds fantastic. Thank you. So thank you for that, Andrew. Thank you, Kevin. That's really good scene setting for the conversation that we're hoping to have now. So where I wanted to start, and I was going to move around the panel with these questions. So I'll probably start with you, Andrew. So we're talking about how trust is important in the context of how data is collected, used, and shared. What's the ODI's experience of how organisations currently demonstrate their trustworthiness?
Cool, thank you. So I think there are a number of mechanisms. I think there's a lot of organisations who are forced to trust each other with no real idea of the trustworthiness between them, where it's all very informal, almost gentlemen's agreements. And if organisations are familiar with one another or work in the same sector, and it's not personal data or sensitive data, that's probably good enough. I think one of the other ways organisations are demonstrating trust when they're sharing data is by kind of using things like clear licensing in government. You know, the Open Government License was quite transformational in terms of controlling access to data. But actually, where it's more sensitive and where we're on the kind of shared data part of the data spectrum, data sharing agreements are a really good mechanism for building trust between organisations. I think the challenge that we have, though, is that there isn't any sort of standard way for an organisation to be able to look at another organisation and to understand how they will act when data is shared with them. So even if you have a data sharing agreement with an organization, you don't necessarily know that the organization is going to behave in the way that you would expect it to with your data. And I think the data practices can be useful to help organizations understand each other at that point of data sharing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. And Victoria, I'm going to come to you now. I was just conscious that it's been very, very male conversation so far. So I think definitely you need to change that up a bit. So in the context of the work that Kevin was talking about and that kind of framework that you've developed, how does that help sort of develop that demonstration of trustworthiness and the approaches that people are taking?
Yes, I think an important thing to note is that Andrew really well covered the relationship between two organizations that would want to share data. I think what our framework also allows to do is, yes, demonstrate that, but also think about the end users, the citizens, and other stakeholders who might be coming across these services. And so I think at the moment, trustworthiness is obviously something organizations want, but I think they're kind of counting on not messing up and maintaining trust that way. So what this framework allows to do is to continue the not messing up, or make sure that the mess up doesn't happen, by making sure that ethics is embedded from the start. And so these these potentially trust limiting issues are not entering the data lifecycle. But I think what additionally is really important throughout the lifecycle and in the framework that we focus on is the transparency aspect. And so, we know that a lot of organizations will have some sort of practices, they will have some sort of principles that they might be communicating to the customers, because it is recognized that, end users want to hear more and more about that. But actually, there is no way of checking that, again, to your point, Andrew, that the organization is actually following through with that. So, our framework emphasizes the importance of looking at each stage of the kind of information we'd want to communicate and targeting that information to the right audience as well, so that not only you're embedding the right things, but you're talking about them in a way that reassures others who may want to know, so that you don't damage that trust. So it's both the procedural part, but I think also the communication part that's often lacking.
I think
that's fantastic. Sorry, go on, Andrew.
Jump in there. I think it's that point about communication with users is really important, and organizations that should be trustworthy with data can lose that trust really quickly if they're not clear with users about what data they're going to use and how they're going to use it. And we've all seen the news recently about data within the NHS, and that's just one example of an organization that should be trustworthy perhaps losing some of its trustworthiness because they're not communicating with users clearly. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I was gonna pick on a similar point actually, and the word transparency you used, Victoria, I thought was the one that really resonated with me, and it's really noticeable as you go through the 9 data practices that it's not just about having the practice and your approach to the practice, but it's being open and transparent, that you can demonstrate and show that you've done that as well. So no, that's fantastic. Great, thank you for those answers. Jane, I was going to come to you and just sort of ask, with your kind of data institutions hat on and the work the ODI has done around data institutions, how do you see these practices meshing into that work and helping organisations in the future and that piece of work?
Yeah, I think this is going to be really important for data institutions. I mean, just to quickly give a flavour of some of the scope of some of the work we do on the programme. So, for example, at the moment, we are supporting the development of an open data platform to support the UK water sector with greater transparency and efficiency. But we're also delivering a peer learning network to a group of global organisations who are using data to improve workers' rights. And then we're supporting in a very practical way, we're supporting the delivery of an advisory board of patient and stakeholders for a data trust that provides eye scan data for medical research. So it's really wide ranging. And I think for me, where the practices are really helpful is, you've been talking about the data life cycle, and I think of the life cycle of a data institution. And, when we look at that, at the very beginning of a data institution, when somebody might just have the idea for they think it would be good to steward some data and there would be some public benefit in doing that, but they're not quite sure what it should be or how or who should be involved. that scoping phase, there's a real important element of trustworthiness there around making sure they understand they've got a use case and they're not just going to go and collect data and not really know what for or who's going to be involved, and back to that stakeholder engagement piece. So there's that part at that scoping phase. And then once they've established what it is the data institution needs to be, they move on to the design phase, and then you get more into the detailed design of the institution, so more around the privacy issues and the technical platform and the data sharing agreements and the documentation and the compliance and all of that. So and then beyond that you get into the delivery and the ongoing maintenance, etc. So at every stage of the data institution, these practices can help in different ways and be applied in the way we at the ODI support data institutions at every stage of their life, even to the point of, one of the practices is around sustainability. And I think that's really important for a data institution, because you can set up this model and you could be, say, for example, there's a data institution providing health and safety data for the construction industry. What happens if that data institution runs out of money, or the funding runs out, and there's a whole ecosystem of organizations who are depending on that data essentially to keep people alive, but suddenly that data is not accessible because the data institution has run out of money. So that's a really another important element of the trustworthiness, and that's there in the practices and where we can support at every stage of the data institution's life cycle.
That's great. I really like that. And as I said in my intro, I've been involved in this project. So it's really great to hear you saying that those different stages will apply the practices in different ways, because I think that's exactly what was intended. So that's fantastic. So Kevin, I just wanted to move us on just a little bit with the discussion. So we're obviously talking in kind of quite a theoretical way here, to some extent. So there's lots of theories around when data's collected, used, and shared, and it being done in a trustworthy and ethical manner. I just wondered if you could share with us some of your experiences of actually trying to apply some of those approaches in practice and how they've influenced your approach at Sopra Steria.
Yeah, sure. I think Wiktoria and Andrew have both talked about reaching out to stakeholders, and by that we take a very expansive and inclusive understanding of what's meant by stakeholders, so everybody who can be affected by or impacted by the use of data or technology, to understand what the impacts are on those people. And so in our practice, we've gone out and carried out both qualitative and quantitative research with customers, with user groups, or with stakeholders who may not be users, external to our clients, as well as speaking to people internally to understand what culture is, to really get a flavor of what levels of trust are, where trust exists, where trust does not exist. And in fact, we've just a couple of weeks ago published our second annual report of citizen trust in government online services, looking at what it is that people across the UK are expecting from government. And in fact, this year we expanded that out to also look at healthcare, retail, financial services, and social media as well, to see where those levels of trust were and how to achieve those levels of trust as best we can. So talking to people is clearly a first step. We've already talked quite a bit about transparency, and I think I would completely endorse that, but just add the thought about the audience that one is being transparent to. So, for example, the use of cookies on the World Wide Web is now extremely transparent to everybody in Europe, thanks to the Cookies Directive, but in a way that's quite intrusive, and we don't really read the terms and conditions anymore. We just click yes and then move on. I think it's important with being transparent that you're transparent in the right way to the right people. So don't give me a privacy statement that goes on for 15 pages, because I won't read it. But if I want to access the application, I'll still click yes. So how are we transparent in the right way? Do we have the right institutions or the right auditors or regulators or whatever to ensure that transparency functions. Democracy doesn't have to mean that the people have access to everything in order to hold every institution accountable. We have institutions that can be representative of the people to hold industry and government bodies accountable.
That's really interesting. I was just scribbling a little note down there because how you described that reminded me sort of from my area of work with how the law and data and people intersect, and that terms and conditions point is really interesting. You know, how often do we scroll down, click through, and don't even read it? And there's the part of this the trustworthiness is, you know, if you're explaining what you're intending on doing in a way that humans can understand as opposed to lawyers can understand, that's got to help, right? And I think that's what you're kind of you're getting at there. No, that's really interesting. Andrew,
I think about 10 years ago, so just an amusing
Sure.
anecdote. About 10 years ago, somebody estimated that if we read all of the terms and conditions to the tools that we signed up to, it would take 3 months full-time reading. And that was 10 years back. So goodness knows what it would be now. Sorry, Mike, carry on.
No, it's fine. You made me think of an anecdote as well. So somebody sent me somebody sent me a message today with a picture that they generated using one of the AI functions, and they said, "Oh, I'm not sure what the issues are with this. I uploaded a photo of myself and a picture of an artwork, and they've generated this." And I said, "Well, it kind of depends who took the photo of you, really, because they own the copyright. Did you ask them?" And that kind of blew his mind straight away. But hey, that's just a niche IP joke. So and Andrew, I'll come to you with this sort of the similar question to ask Kevin, really, which is that kind of, how did the ODI go about sort of looking at the theory and some of the other models that are around when sort of developing the approach to trust and trustworthiness and the practices? I realise that's a bit of a curveball.
So it's a really big question. You know, as ODI, we have we have a huge amount of experience of working with different types of clients in government and in commercial sectors, and through that work, we've built quite a good understanding of what good looks like. Our research, our kind of one of our aims has been to understand whether there is a market for data assurance, and the research that we've done shows that there is a market for data assurance. Organizations want to be assured that they are doing data in the right way, and organizations consuming data want to be assured that the data they're consuming is well managed, isn't going to destroy their systems, is going to meet their needs. I think we are finding that at the kind of data level, some of the technical assurance that is required is happening, largely because people are moving their data onto the cloud, and Amazon and Google and AWS and the large cloud providers aren't going to accept data onto their platforms that is going to impact on those platforms. So there's a level of technical assurance of data going on. But I think what we found was that there wasn't a lot of assurance of the risks of sharing data. So one of the things I'll talk about towards the end of the call is the data sharing risk assessment, which is our view on how to assess the risk of sharing data. But I think you know, we've developed our practices based on our knowledge of how organizations behave, based on our research, based on our engagement with organizations. And I think we've also, you know, we have experts in things like the Dharma frameworks, and we've been able to use that knowledge in developing the practices as well. Sorry, that's a bit of a woolly answer to a woolly question.
Well, I'd like to think the question was very pointed, but anyway, no, thanks, Andrew. I just wanted to take a second now just to sort of say to the people on the call, if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask the panel, please feel free to add them into the chat. I'm looking at it as we go through, so yeah, add any questions into there. Victoria, I just wanted to ask you a bit of a question, sort of building on what Andrew was just saying about how the ODI developed the practices and this approaches. How do you see something like this helping you in the broader work that you're doing and your existing work in this space?
Yeah, I think the practices are really, really useful, because often when we jump into ethics and, you know, organizations launch to do something about ethics, they forget that there's a lot of other things that need to happen in the first place, and that maturity around data practices needs to be there. So I think, you know, these practices will allow to inform that conversation and probably benchmark where the organization is. I'm not saying that you need to be really mature to be thinking about ethics, but to make ethics happen and to introduce these privacy considerations, you do need to make sure that all the other things are in place as well. Because, you know, effectively, if your data is all over the place and, you know, if you don't have other existing structures in place, kind of in light of the practices that you've put forward, then you can have really great, yet another set of ethics principles that goes nowhere just because there isn't that organizational side that really supports it. So I see that particularly around resourcing and capability. I think that is a big challenge still. And, you know, as we look to what happened with Gen AI this year, you know, I think I see that happening with data too, where we launch to adopt something, to do something because we've got that great idea that can help our business, but actually questioning, you know, do we have the right skills and capabilities to understand what we're doing and to do it in a robust way, first of all, and then thinking about all the ethics considerations that come with it. You know, I see these as very closely related questions that often get forgotten, disturbingly so. So absolutely, I see the practices as something that will inform our conversations moving forward and help us frame some of these questions to kind of the step around ethics, if you will, to really help us build that more resilience in organizations when it comes to how they use data.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that answer. And that's great to hear as well. Kevin, I wanted to come across to you because Ed's asked a question in the chat around. It's almost back to the demonstration of trustworthiness, or the demonstration that you've reached a certain level of compliance with, say, your ethical approaches. Do you think that like a certification approach might play a role, like a standard and benchmark level might play a role in the future in demonstrating your ethical approaches and your trustworthiness?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that it could, and I think that in many ways it should. I suppose I am feeling a slight sense of caution here as to what has been happening over the last year or two in the ESG space around environmental monitoring and environmental certifications that has been contested, insofar as there are lots of different ways of measuring somebody's environmental footprint, or their ESG score, rather. And I think there is a risk of having a plethora of certification systems, which would mean that nobody ultimately really knew which ones to trust. So by contrast, where we have things like type marks from the British Standards Institute, where we would have one single national standard, that would be very helpful. And then you could have organizations that are qualified to go out and carry out audits on their behalf to be able to give the kite mark. So some sort of centralized system like that, I think, could be effective and be tremendously helpful. In the sort of intermediate stage, before we get there, absolutely, consultancies like ODI, like Sopra Steria, could be helpful in going out and giving assurance to people that their data and their practices are ethical. But how far we could be contributing to that certification space in a useful way, I'm less sure about. I think that should be done by a central, reliable, independent body, but we could certainly be helping organizations to get to that standard on a more regular basis.
So,
yeah, I was going to say, Andrew, I can see, Andrew.
I think I broadly agree with Kevin's answer. I'd make a couple of additional points there. I think to be able to certify, there must be a standard to certify against. And, you know, at ODI, kind of one of our long-term ideas is that we could be that certification organization, that we could set the standard and we could somehow certify organizations against that standard. But at the moment, we don't know enough. So we've identified the 9 areas of data practice. But actually, and we understand that being able to demonstrate good practice in those 9 areas means that an organization is probably trustworthy. But actually, the specific measures in each of those 9 practice areas still need definition. We still need to work out what good looks like in each of the 9 practice areas. And actually, that's probably not something for us to do on our own. That's something that probably needs to be done in a collaborative way through a standards board. As ODI, we would probably lean towards an open standards process. But Kevin's right. You know, those formal groups like BSI and ISO are really important as well. I think the other thing I'd say about certification, it probably needs to sit in with some of the other certification frameworks that exist for organizations. So how would a data certification sit alongside the kind of standards for audit, or the standards for accountancy, or the standards for legal? And I think we need to kind of be careful there.
Thank you, Andrew. Jane, I saw you. Yeah, absolutely. Go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, 2 things that I'd like to say in response to that. The first is slightly playing devil's advocate, but with I would say a slight health warning around certification, in that, and especially we've done a lot of work around responsible data stewardship and looking into the concept of responsible and what that means to different people in different contexts, in different geographies. And one of the things that comes out very strongly is, of course, that everything around this is context specific. So if you set a minimal level for trustworthiness, that doesn't necessarily apply in different contexts. You know, what might be responsible in a Western organization might not be in the global South. And organizations are operating in very different environments and very different cultures, and it has to take that into consideration. And I think that can make certification and minimum standards problematic to an extent. So I just want to say that. The other thing is on the talking about business frameworks, I'm really interested in this. I've been looking at particularly at frameworks like responsible business frameworks like B Corp. And where I'm interested in that is that those standards, data is not an active ingredient in those standards. So data is seen only as a tool for measuring and reporting, but actually an organization can pass and be awarded B Corp certification. Nobody has scrutinized whether that organization has got responsible data practices at all, or whether that organization is seeking to do any good with its data. So nobody's establishing its trustworthiness from a data perspective. Data is only used as a tool for reporting. And I think there's a huge piece of work to be done there. Interestingly, B Labs are renewing their standards next year. So I think there's an opportunity to really try to, I think, influence them to introduce data more strongly in their framework.
That's really interesting, and it touches on a question that Francesca asked almost at the moment that you started speaking, Jane, around certifications leading to rubber stamping rather than being about trustworthiness in general. And I think that if I was to play back to what I was hearing as you were speaking, it's almost there's a cultural thing, that trustworthiness is about demonstrating a cultural thing, which is really hard to just be like a tick box thing. And in different scenarios, it's going to be and look very different. There's one final question in the chat from Kevin, or there might be more questions, but this is the final question I'm taking from the chat from Kevin, which is around sort of market leaders in this space, around demonstrating trust, or the value of demonstrating trustworthy data practices. So we're running out of time, so it needs to be a shortish answer, but I'll open it with the Sopra Steria people. Do you think there's anybody leading in this space other than Sopra Steria, of course? Is there anybody else leading in this space?
I think worryingly no one comes to mind. So I would need to think. I don't know, Kevin, if you've got a different view, or where you would absolutely point at someone, you know, you'd say is.
I think the challenge is that we so often hear only about the bad cases. We hear about the problems. We don't often hear about the good cases, and certainly not from sort of independent journalistic sources. And so that can lead to a degree of cynicism that everybody ultimately is out there for their own benefit, which simply isn't true. And we know that from our clients and people who come and say they want to, make sure that they're being ethical. But no, people will sort of shout about their own organizations, but some form of independent review or whatever, you know, that there are ongoing awards that you get in different sectors, different industry sectors for ethical practice, which could be helpful. But no, there isn't a particular group which springs to mind as saying these are the paragons of how you could treat data. And again, coming back to Jane's point, partly because it's contextual. So how would you compare what people are doing with data in the oil industry with what people are doing with data in healthcare, for example? They could both be ethical to greater or lesser degrees in their particular context, and still more so when you go international. So I think it's quite challenging to find somebody that would be an exemplar there.
That's great, thanks. The one example that pops into my head that's interesting and current is that the whole structure of OpenAI and how they'd structured themselves as an organization with an independent board. But even then, as we've seen recently, that can fall apart in an instant, depending on trustworthy or not trustworthy decision making. I'll leave that one hanging there as a thought provoker. Andrew, yeah.
So I think Kevin's absolutely right in his answer. I think I would flag a few sectors where I could see trustworthiness being important and therefore organisations being keen to be pioneers. Health is a really obvious sector where this could be really important. Smart data, so that is the kind of where we're exchanging data that is almost semi-personal, so finance, energy, retail, and increasingly, you know, that data is going to be exchanged between organisations to make decisions about things like how much our bill should be, how much loyalty we're showing, and prices we pay for products in store, and trusting that those big decisions are going to be made on good quality, accessible data is going to be really important. And then the last one is insurance. Underwriting decisions are being increasingly made on the basis of data. And actually, if you're making an insurance claim, you're going to absolutely want to be able to trust that the insurance company is using data fairly to make the decision about that claim that you're making and that they're processing.
Brilliant. That's great. And I think a couple of good examples there to kind of finish off this kind of round table bit. So firstly, I'm going to say thank you to the panel for the conversation you've just had there. Loads of good stuff, and actually I'm a bit disappointed we've run out of time because it was a really good conversation. I really like where we were heading, and we must reconvene and have another chat. I think it's really good. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually now going to ask Andrew a final question, which is a loaded question to lead to the next slide, which is, can you tell me a little bit about how the ODI sees the practices being applied in the future, and what work you're doing around those?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mike. And Sam, if we jump to the next slide. So in terms of resources that are available to everybody who's on this call, I think the first thing I would say is that we have produced a short guide that introduces the data practices and the indicators for each data practice. That's available on the ODI website. It's a neat PDF that you can download. You can read it in about 10 minutes and you'll understand the data practices and why they're important. We're also thinking at ODI about how we can apply the data practices in the real world, and we've built 2 new tools. They're both available at the moment in private beta. So the first one is a data practice assessment, and what that tool does is it asks a set of questions against each of those indicators that I talked about, and it helps leaders assess the strengths and weaknesses of the data practices within their organisation. It probably takes about half an hour to do a data practice assessment for an organisation, and at the end of the process you get a report that shows you it's a beta, so it tries to give you a trustworthiness score. We'd be interested to know how successful that is, and it gives you some areas. It flags the areas where you need to improve. The second tool is a data sharing risk assessment tool. This is designed to help you identify risks when sharing data, and this is presented as a checklist. So you've made the decision that you would like to share some data. You define what the data is, and then you answer a set of questions about the data, and it tells you what the risks associated with sharing that data might be. It probably takes between 10 and 15 minutes to do a data sharing risk assessment, and again, that's available as a private beta. We would really like people to have a play with these private betas and really importantly give us feedback on them. So you can find those on the ODI website. I've posted a link into the chat. I see Abbas has already beaten me to it, but that's the link to where the guide and those products can be found. And these are new things from the ODI. I think the other thing I'd mention is that, of course, ODI has a really well-established offer around data ethics, and you can find details of that on the ODI website as well. So that's what I want to say about products, really. But I think back to Joe.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for such a fascinating discussion. So when I was writing down, just to say thank you to all the speakers, and a huge thank you to Sam, who's been behind the scenes, and he's the guy that's looking after all the slides. What I'll say to everybody then, thank you for everyone who came. I'm going to be sending a questionnaire out tomorrow, and I've just written down to ask a question about, do we want to do another session? And if you were interested in doing another data assurance session, please let us know. And it'll be definitely something I think we might well be up for. So like I said, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Kevin. Thank you to Victoria. Thank you to Mike, to Andrew, and to Jane. That's been brilliant. Thank you to everybody who's made time in their busy schedules to come today. Like I said, I'll be sending you a questionnaire. And just to give you the flag, just to flag up that we've got our next event, which is going to be using the data ethics maturity model, and that's going to be in January next year. So, and I think that's probably it from us. So what can I say? Thank you and goodbye, and hopefully see you all very, very soon. Right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.